Chapter 6, Syllogistic Inferences Psychologically Considered. Syllogistic and Chemical Formulae. 30 attempts at interpreting syllogistic principles psychologically. The discussions of our last chapter have mainly been on the ground of the law of contradiction, since in its case, as in the case of all fundamental logical principles, psychologistic interpretations are very tempting. The thought motives that push our thinking in this direction have, in fact, a strong air of obviousness. Empiricistic doctrines are less often specially applied to the laws of the syllogism. Their reducibility to the basic logical principles makes it seem needless to take further trouble with them. If the logical axioms are psychological laws, and the syllogistic rules follow in a purely deductive manner from these axioms, these syllogistic rules must also count as psychological. It might be thought that each fallacious inference would furnish a decisive counter-example, and that the deduction here in question would provide us with an argument against any psychological interpretation of the logical axioms. It might further be thought that the care needed in laying down, whether in thought or word, the supposed psychological content of the axioms, would convince the empiricists that such interpretations can contribute nothing whatever to proving the syllogistic formulae. Wherever such a proof succeeds, its premises and conclusions alike have the status of laws, which differ toto silo from what are called laws in psychology. But even the clearest refutations break upon the complacent conviction of the psychologistic doctrine. G. Heymans, in his recent elaborate development of the doctrine, is so little dismayed by the existence of fallacious arguments, that he even regards his psychological view as confirmed by the possibility of pointing out such fallacies. For this pointing out does not consist in bettering our thought habits, which do not as yet conform to the law of contradiction, but in drawing attention to an unnoticed contradiction in our wrong syllogism. One might well ask whether contradictions that pass unnoticed are not genuine contradictions, and whether our logical law merely affirms the impossibility of unifying contradictions that are noticed, while allowing unnoticed contradictions to be jointly true. Again, one need only reflect on the difference between psychological and logical incompatibility, to be quite clear that we are once more lost in the thick fog of the aforementioned ambiguities. It would not profit us greatly to say that talk of unnoticed contradictions in fallacious arguments is improper, that the contradiction first emerges as a novelty in the course of the thought train that refutes it, that this emergence has as a further, psychological, consequence that we feel ourselves bound to reject this argument as invalid. One thought movement has one consequence, another. No psychological law connects a refutation with a fallacy. The fallacy makes an appearance on countless occasions without the refutation, and retains our conviction. What right has one thought shift, which only follows the fallacy in certain psychological circumstances, to attribute absolute contradiction to the latter, and not merely to say that it is an invalidity in the circumstances, but that it is an objective, absolute invalidity? The same naturally holds in regard to the correct syllogistic forms in relation to their justifying demonstration through the logical axioms. How can the demonstrative thought train that only arises in certain mental circumstances rise to the claim that the syllogistic form it justifies is absolutely valid? The psychologistic doctrine has no acceptable answer to such questions. Here as elsewhere it lacks the capacity to make sense of the claim made by logical truths to objective validity, and therewith also their functioning as absolute norms of correct and false judgment. How often has it been observed and objected that the identification of logical with psychological law would also destroy every difference between correct and incorrect thinking, since the incorrect modes of judgment are no less governed by psychological laws than the correct ones? Or should we perhaps follow an arbitrary convention, and treat the outcome of certain laws as correct, of others as incorrect? How does the empiricist counter such objections? The thought that is directed to truth no doubt strives to achieve thought combinations that are free from contradiction, but the value of these non-contradictory thought combinations again plainly resides in the circumstance that the non-contradictory alone can be asserted, that the law of contradiction is therefore a natural law of thinking. One thought is here credited with an extraordinary niceness towards the non-contradictory, when there are, and can be, no other than non-contradictory combinations, if, indeed, there really is a law of nature to such an effect. Or is the argument any better if one says, we have no reason to condemn the combination of two mutually contradictory judgments as incorrect, beyond the fact that we instinctively and immediately experience it as impossible to assert two such judgments together? If one seeks to show, independently of this fact, that only the non-contradictory may be asserted, one finds repeatedly that the proof always presupposes what it has to prove, opposite p. 69. One at once sees the operation of the ambiguities analyzed above. Our insight into the logical law that contradictory propositions are not both true is identified with the instinctive, supposedly immediate sensation of psychological inability to perform contradictory acts of judgment at the same time. Self-evidence and blind conviction, exact and empirical generality, logical incompatibility of states of affairs and psychological incompatibility of acts of belief, impossibility of joint truth and impossibility of joint belief, all run together. 31 Syllogistic and chemical formulae. Heymans has tried to lend plausibility to the doctrine that syllogistic formulae express empirical laws of thinking by likening them to chemical formulae. Just as a chemical formula 2H2 plus 02 equals 2H20 only expresses the general fact that, in suitable circumstances, 2 volumes of hydrogen combine with 1 volume of oxygen to form 2 volumes of water, so the logical formula max plus may equals Gx plus 11y merely expresses the fact that, in suitable circumstances, 2 universal affirmative judgments with a common subject, produce 2 new particular judgments in consciousness, in which the predicate concepts of the original judgment appear both as predicate and as subject concepts. Why in this case 2 new judgments are produced, but not in the case of the combination mex and me why, we are at present ignorant. Repeated experiment will, however, assure us of the irrefragable necessity which governs these relationships, a necessity which compels us to affirm the conclusion when we have conceded the premises. Heymans, opposite p. 62. The institution of these experiments of course demands an exclusion of disturbing influences, and this consists in representing the premise judgments to oneself as clearly as possible, letting the mechanism of thought operate, and then waiting for the generation or non-generation of a new judgment. If a new judgment really arises, one must look closely to see whether there are not any intermediate stages in consciousness beside the beginning and end point, and must take note of these latter as exactly and completely as possible, opposite p. 57. What astonishes us in this conception is the assertion that, in the case of combinations excluded by logicians, no new judgments are generated. If we consider every fallacy of, for example, the form xem plus me y equals xey, we shall have to say that generally, in suitable circumstances, 2 judgments of the forms xem and me y generate a new judgment in consciousness. The analogy with the chemical formulae fits just as correctly or as badly as in the other cases. Naturally one is not permitted to reply that the circumstances are unlike in the 2 cases. They are psychologically of equal interest, and the corresponding empirical propositions of equal value. Why then do we draw such a fundamental distinction between the 2 classes of formulae? If the question were put to us, we should naturally reply, because we see in the case of the one that what they express are truths, while, in the case of the other, they are falsehoods. The empiricist, however, cannot give this answer. On the interpretations he accepts, the empirical propositions corresponding to fallacious inferences are valid in the same way as are those which correspond to other inferences. The empiricist appeals to the experience of irrefragable necessity, which, if the premises are conceded, compels us also to hold the conclusion to be true. But all syllogisms, whether logically justified or not, come about with psychological necessity, and the felt compulsion, when it is felt, is always the same. One who incurs a fallacy, and sustains it against critical objections, feels irrefragable necessity, the compulsion of not being able to think otherwise, in exactly the same way as the man who draws a correct conclusion and continues to recognize its correctness. Like all judgment, the drawing of conclusions is no arbitrary matter. This felt irrefragability so little proves real irrefragability that it may yield to the force of new reasons, even in the case of correctly drawn conclusions recognized as such. It should therefore not be confused with the genuine logical necessity that pertains to every syllogistic inference, which means, and can mean, nothing beyond the insightfully knowable, though not actually known by each judging person, validity of the syllogism, with its governance by ideal law. The law-governed character of this validity certainly first makes itself known in the insight with which we apprehend the syllogistic principle. In comparison with this, the insight accompanying a conclusion drawn here and now, seems to be an insight into the necessary validity of the particular case, i.e. a validity grounded in the law. The empiricist thinks that we are as yet ignorant why the combinations of premises condemned by logic yield no conclusion. Does he expect to discover more as knowledge widens? One would imagine that here at least we know everything that can be known, for here we see that each possible form of conclusion, i.e. each conclusion falling in the framework of syllogistic combinations, will combine with the combinations of premises in question to yield a false syllogistic law. One would think that, in such a case, even an infinitely perfect intelligence could have nothing more to know. To such and like objections, one of another sort may be added. It is no less powerful, but seems less important for our purposes. It cannot be doubted that the analogy with chemical formulae does not reach far, not far enough, I consider, for us to treat very seriously the psychological laws that have been confused with the logical laws. In the chemical case, we know the circumstances in which the syntheses expressed in the formulae take place. They can be very precisely stated. This is why we count chemical equations as among the most valuable inductions of natural science. In the psychological case, on the other hand, our knowledge of the circumstances amounts to so little, that we have in the end nothing more to say than that people quite often think in conformity with logical laws. Circumstances which cannot be specified exactly, such as a certain concentration of attention, a certain mental freshness, a certain preparedness etc., are favorable conditions for the emergence of a logical act of inference. The circumstance or conditions, in the strict sense, from which the inferential act of judgment follows with causal necessity, are entirely hidden from us. The situation being what it is quite understandable that no psychologist has so far thought of introducing, one by one, into psychology, generalizations which can be connected with syllogistic formulae, and which involve the vague circumstances just mentioned. Nor has any psychologist tried to dignify such generalizations with the title of laws of thought. After all this, we may count as a hopeless undertaking, in the sense of Kant, Heyman's interesting attempt, full of stimulating points that have not been mentioned here, at a theory of knowledge that could also be called a chemistry of judgments, and that is nothing more than a psychology of thinking. It will at least not make us swerve from our rejection of psychologistic interpretations. Syllogistic formulae do not have the empirical content men attribute to them. Their true sense is plainest when we state them in the equivalent form of ideal incompatibilities. For example, it is universally the case that two propositions having the forms all ms are x and no p is m are not true unless a proposition having the form some x are not p is also true. And so in every case. Nothing is here said about a consciousness or the acts and circumstances of its judgment etc. If one keeps the true content of the syllogistic formulae in mind, one will vanquish the illusion that makes the experimental production of the insightful judgment which recognizes the syllogistic principle, into an experimental proof of that principle, or into something that can lead to such a proof.